The Tasmanian tiger, easily distinguished by his straight, unjointed tail, is also a dangerous opponent, though, like the devil, is now very rare, being forced out of its natural habitat by the march of civilization. This is the only one in captivity in the world.
I'm 94 and I was probably 4 or 5 when I saw the tiger. I remember going twice. It could have been 3 times, but I remember twice. And we would get the tram into the GPO in Hobart from Lenna Valley. And then we would walk around the Domain Road to the zoo. But before you got to the zoo, you would, in those days, smell it. But you would hear the Tasmanian tiger. So not a high-pitched sound, a low guttural sound. It didn't sound like a dog howling, for instance. It probably a mournful sound, low, mournful sound, yeah. But it did make that sound quite a bit and paraded up and down this very small area. It didn't stop still. It looked moth-eaten because it probably didn't have the right food, and it was old, obviously, and not cared for. I felt sad. Yeah, it was by itself, and it was sad, yeah. I don't know why, but that's one of the things I've always thought about. It will always be there for me. You know, the smell, just seeing it pace up and down. It hasn't left me. No, it hasn't left me. So obviously it was something that really, well, it has stuck in my memory, yes. So that's a long time ago. To think that it was there, caged in that little area. I know in that day and age, it was different. A zoo was entirely different to what it is now. But I think now, if I knew it was there, I wouldn't want to go back and see it like that. I don't think I would. I really don't. It's too, sorry. It's not how an animal should live. I really don't think that the Tasmanian tiger is still around. I think that, sadly, it is extinct.
So we have around 25 species of extinct mammals in these cabinets of the 34 or so that are thought to be extinct in Australia. So we have around 40 different specimens of thylacine in the collection. Most of them are skulls. We have 7 skins, 3 of which are mounted. So when I say mounted, we mean a thylacine that was mounted in a position to go on display. This one was mounted in this interesting crouching position, looking very vicious, because of course thylacines were thought to be, great vicious animals that attacked sheep and, were dangerous and all that. So that tells us a lot about the attitude, basically, to thylacines at the time. You can see the pouch here. So thylacines are basically the largest of the recent marsupial carnivores to survive in Australia. They were placed in their own separate family, the Thylacinidae, which is why it was so tragic that we lost them, because they were the last species in a long line of thylacines that ranged in size from like sort of cat-sized right up to bigger than this one. So when you lose a whole family of marsupials, that's a big loss of biodiversity. So this one obviously had a pouch young. They could have up to 4 young at any one time. There's 4 teats. Generally the number was 2 or 3. This one came from the Tasmanian Museum. So this one actually came into our collection in 1893. This is an early mammal register. So mostly when it comes to the thylacine specimens, we don't know a lot about where they came from. This specimen here, registered as M1674, but that's the one that we have on display, and we didn't know a lot about it. But then a researcher down in Tasmania found this photograph of a recently dead thylacine. We were able to match it as to this specimen. You can see the stripe. This is the same, because their stripes are actually quite unique to each individual. But it came into the museum on the 6th of August 1902. It's a female, Professor Haswell's, and it was mounted as a gallery specimen. Superficially, a thylacine skull looks a little bit like a wolf or a dog, but there are definite marsupial features. They're definitely a carnivore. You can see the great canine here, which would have been used for gripping prey. We don't know a huge amount about them, but it's assumed that they preyed mostly on small to medium-sized mammals, occasionally taking wallabies and kangaroos. We're now learning more about thylacines in hindsight, because to rely on what was known at the time was very little. So with advances in technology, especially molecular biology, they're now able to work out, the diversity in the population at the time, what the closest relative was, even looking at the anatomy, getting an idea of how it may have hunted and killed its prey and so on. Of the species we have here, half of them are marsupials roughly, and the other half are roughly rodents. But of the marsupials, certain groups are definitely more represented than others. The macropods and the bandicoots in particular are the ones that have suffered the most. So this is a pig-footed bandicoot, Chiropus equaudatus, which means without a tail, I believe, because the original specimen didn't have a tail. Yeah, so they assumed that they were all like that. Oftentimes, this museum is the only place in the world that has specimens of a certain species. In this case, there's very few museums that have this species, which is the broad-faced potteroo, and there's only about a dozen specimens that we know of in the world of this species. So you're looking at roughly half of them in this tray. So this drawer contains some of the rodents that we've lost, and this here is the bramble K melames. This is the most recent addition to the extinct cabinet. So in 2016, I had the unenviable task of going to the main collection and pulling them out from the other melames. They lived on Bramble Cay, which is a small sort of coral cay on tip of Cape York. And with sea level rise, apparently the vegetation just was basically inundated, and there was nowhere else for them to shelter, nothing to eat. They basically, just disappeared. The last one I think was seen in about 2009, and then by 2016 it was apparent that they were gone. It does make you very sad and very frustrated, I think, that we just didn't value the fauna that we had. It's certainly an alarm bell. It's really, don't take anything for granted. And also extinction can be very, very quiet and very slow. One thing that I've learned just from my study many years ago on spectacled hair wallabies and northern nail-tailed wallabies is just how important it is to study species while they're widespread, because you can get all the information from lots of different locations, and that is just so valuable if something does happen. You've got the information there. It's so hard when a decline has already happened and you're just limited to one little pocket, then it's very hard to work out a conservation plan for something based on that. But if you can study things while they are still widespread and common and really get all that information, that's going to be crucially important.
So I started doing honours on a mammal, partly by chance, on the smoky mouse, which is an endangered mouse that lives in southeastern New South Wales. One of my interests initially, but then something I started working on a lot, I started following up subfossil deposits. So not fossils per se, but bones left in caves, in particular by owls. And they're less than 200 years old. They're an indication of the natural fauna of an area. And what you realise is that most of the small mammals don't exist most of the places they used to be through southeastern New South Wales, and that has some pretty big implications for how the whole ecosystem is functioning. The benchmark, I guess, for that was what John Gould knew about Australia's mammals. So that was really through the 1860s that he and his collectors were finding mammals. And the historical baseline for what mammals lived where sort of comes from that period, because a lot of them were not seen again until the 1960s. So animals like the chestnut mouse and the mountain pygmy possum, which wasn't known except from fossils, but a lot of animals were actually rediscovered or discovered as living animals in the 1960s. And through that whole period in between, people really went looking for a lot of the small mammals. We really don't know how recently things disappeared, but there was definitely a really big pulse of extinction around the turn of the 1900s on the back of a massive wave of rabbits through the late 1800s and then the introduction of the fox. That really was the nail in the coffin for a lot of local populations, at least, and particularly in the drier, flatter areas. So there's obviously some headline species like the Thylacine, but another animal that's almost as spectacularly different that most people have never heard of is the pig-footed bandicoot. It's a strange little animal that lived out in the drier country and unique. It was a bandicoot and it was related to the other bandicoots, but its morphology was quite different to all the ones that are left. And even behind me, out on the plains around Lake George, the eastern quoll, there's accounts of people riding through there and hundreds of quolls scattering from in front of them, and that's backed up by the fact that when rabbits started to invade Western New South Wales from the local area, people were catching hundreds of quolls, putting them on trains and sending them out west to try and deal with rabbits. Obviously there's a lot of clearing of, especially historically, of a lot of the more arable areas for pastoral and agricultural things. Things become more insidious as you move into areas that aren't cleared. There's a lot of forest, there's a lot of habitat out there, but again, the species that were in there are gone, and things like foxes and cats are a critical part of that story. By taking that predation pressure off, we actually see that a lot of populations can actually bounce back. So the animals are more resilient than we probably give them credit for sometimes. And by addressing the threats, sometimes they actually manage to recover to a reasonable degree by themselves. And we've seen that on the back of the 2019-20 fires. A lot of mammals have recovered to much, much higher levels after the fire than they were before. Because of favourable conditions after the fire, not necessarily because of the fire itself, but in spite of the fire. The animals want to survive and they can be more resilient. And the most critical thing, which does partly go to addressing the blindsiding threats, is actually looking at what's there. So the most basic programs in saving our species are very cheap, very effective, because it's just someone going out once a year or once every few years to make sure that the threatened thing is still present and making sure there isn't a change or an indicator of change. And that's really important. That's something that might not happen, and as I've said, that wasn't happening in the past. But then being able to see threats, getting in and managing those threats on a regular basis is actually a systematic process and a framework there to go out and make sure that it's consistently undertaken. And we're getting better and we're getting more effective tools to address those threats. So we should take heart from that. We can also see from some of the better tools we have now for survey, being able to leave cameras out for long periods of time means we can get a much better idea of what's where, which gives us a much better chance of taking the right actions in the right places, but it's also revealing that some of these things are much more broadly present than we might have thought, even though again they're in very low numbers. The most spectacular recent example would be leadbeater's possum, which we knew from some bone deposits in New South Wales, but which a month and a half ago we discovered is a living animal in New South Wales in Kosciuszko National Park. So going from zero to at least being present is always hopeful. And the fact that that's a fairly distinctive animal that is hiding out, I guess, it obviously gives you a hope that there are other places where a lot of other species may be present, because they are small and they're secretive and there's not that many eyes out there looking for them.
Back in those days, we called it the Tasmanian Tiger. They didn't call it the Thylacine. And they also didn't realise, and that was the last one, until not too late. Otherwise, they might have hopefully protected them a little more. I think no matter what, we've got to protect the animals. They have the right to be here.